This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, our guest is prominent speaker, activist, and best-selling author Shane Claiborne. Shane is a founder of The Simple Way in Philadelphia and heads up the Red Letter Christians, a movement of folks who are committed to living as if Jesus meant the things he said. Shane's work has appeared in Esquire, Christianity Today, Time Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. On this episode, we talk about gun violence, capital punishment, immigration, and holy mischief.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you are tuning in. Welcome. You're aboard of the Vickers Crossing podcast. And the Vickers Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And my name is Rob Henderson, and I'm the rector and priest over at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
Well, that's a good spot over there, too. I'm at St. Aidan's Church. My name is Kevin George, Vicar 2 of the Vickers Crossing. I'm in Northwest London, where I hang out with the digital deacon, who's also on here.
My name is Ian. I'm a producer, creative singer, songwriter person.
He's a digital deacon, too. He brings church on Sunday morning like no man ever could.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And we're glad he's with us, as always, to take care of things here at the Vickers Crossing. And today on the program, we are looking forward to having a really good chat with writer and speaker and activist Shane Claiborne, who will be joining us in just a little bit.
We're very excited to have Shane with us today. Before we get going, though, as has become our custom here, we want to acknowledge that the land upon which we record today's podcast is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenawayapuck, and Attawandaron peoples. On the lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, including First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and all members of First Nations. And we give thanks for them and recognize them as contemporary stewards of this land and vital contributors of our society. And with all, we work towards that day when we have true reconciliation and a sense of oneness with the land and with its people.
Very good. Also, a big thank you to our sponsors. You know, we've got 3 great sponsors here in the Vickers Crossing that have been so faithful to us, and we really appreciate the support. First to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And we give thanks to Dave Mullen and the entire staff today at A. Miller George Funeral Home.
Sending them our love. Good people over there. Also good people over at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Go see Carol Basada. She'll transfer your prescriptions from those big box heartless giants and take you over to her locally owned store and love you like you're one of her own. So go see Carol Basada at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy.
And last but certainly not least, call Molly Maid. Molly Maid, you got a mess? They're there. They're gonna help you clean it up.
Clean up anything.
Big thanks to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Trisha Lister over there at Molly Maid, just fantastic. Just
this week, in fact, I think the day this drops is Trisha Lister's birthday. So happy birthday,
Tricia.
Happy
Wow, good
birthday
for
to
you.
Trisha. So
happy birthday.
I hope there's no mess for you to clean up on your birthday, Trisha.
Oh yeah.
Well, if anybody knows anything about making messes, it's us 3. So,
man, I make a mess of everything I touch.
Yeah, we're good at it. Yeah, we're good at it. All right, guys. Well, I hope you've had a good week. We continue in our lockdown here where we are in Ontario. But I don't know, a little light on the horizon. Vaccines are up. In London, numbers are down a touch.
Yeah.
Overall in Ontario, though, it looks like we're going to be locked in for another couple of weeks, probably.
I think it looks like we're going to get into June in this at least, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd say so. It seems like it. Seems
Yeah.
like it. But
Well,
Mhm.
I mean, I just hope, we saw back in March when they lifted these restrictions too soon, and it was predicted what would happen, and it did, right? It went out of control.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Or in February, they said, if we lift these things too soon. And so I hope this time our local government and authorities go, you know what? No, we're going to wait. We're going to make sure we've got enough vaccines in arms. And,
Get it right.
yep.
Mhm.
Let's
Yeah,
get her
there's no
done.
harm in just waiting it up.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Let's do that. Get back safe. All right, guys. It's time for us to play a quick game that we do here on the Vickers Crossing, and we like to call this game.
It's not a lie if you believe it.
Ooh. What
No,
is
it's
this?
not.
What is this, Rob?
Well, see, what we're going to do is Kevin today is going to be telling us a little bit of a story. And Ian and I are going to try to figure out whether he's telling the truth. But we do always remember that it's not a lie if you believe it. So Kevin may
Right.
be lying to us, but if he
Right.
believes it, it's true
Then-
anyway. So
Then it's all okay.
yeah, it's all okay. We'll let it go. It's
All
not
right.
really. It's not a sin
Okay. It's not a
if
sin.
you believe it.
We absolve you.
we
absolve
absolve you if you
you.
actually believe this is
If you
true or
believe it's true, we absolve you. Okay, you're absolved. All right. So here's the tale, and you need to decide if it's true or not. This is on you now. When I was in high school, I operated and opened a games arcade with 4 pinballs, a couple of pool tables, several video games. And I would open my pool hall / arcade in the afternoons after school and on the weekends. And we just had I had a small counter of confectionery. So a little fridge with some pop, some chips, some chocolate bars, and a few other items that young people like to buy that we won't go into. But we basically ran that for, from sort of through the late winter, early spring, throughout the summer and into the late fall of the next year before I refocused on getting through the last year of school to get to university. So games arcade owner operator here, just to sort of put it out there, right? That was me.
What was it? What would you name this like arcade games place?
Well, they just called it the arcade.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was just called the arcade.
No,
It didn't have like a fancy name.
Oh, you know.
Did not know that Kevin was a pinball wizard. Such.
Yeah.
He's a pinball wizard.
Yeah.
Um,
Has to be a twist.
Never heard that story. Was there a favorite pinball game that you really liked to play? Back in the day, it was pinball, right? They didn't.
Yeah,
have
it was. Yeah, no.
video
There were
games
4
like today.
pinball machines, and I think we rotated them out like 3 times because it was done through a company that would sort of drop equipment off and take it,
Sure.
and they'd take some of the take, and you keep some of the take type thing.
Okay.
So that was the way that worked. So I
And then,
can't
like-
remember. I
Thank
can't remember the
you.
pinball machines.
What about the building? Like where? I just
So-
like
You
where
got a
did
lot
do
of questions.
this?
You guys have a lot of questions.
Oh, I'm trying to make a business plan.
Yeah. The building was a vacant. It used to be a summer confectionery store, and it was vacant. So the owner said, "You know what? I'm gonna make this available to you to do this." So that was the building
Mm.
What do you think, Ian?
in my little community of 300 people.
That's a stumper.
You
That's that because
raked them over the coals pretty good here. What do you think?
All right.
That's really tricky. You know what? I feel like Kevin has some magic touch on that pinball machine, so I'm gonna say that it is true. I believe it. I believe this. He
All right.
got me if it isn't, but I
All
believe
right.
it.
Okay.
Okay. A little voice has been in the back of my head as Kevin was telling that story, and this little voice was saying, "Liar."
It's
No,
not
I-
a lie if you believe it.
If you believe it. Well, you can have all the fantasies you want, but that does not sound like something that happened, and I have a hard time buying into that. So I'm going to say you're lying.
Well, the truth of the matter is that I did. The truth of the matter is that I did, and it was the local business guy was a guy named Craig Drover store, still there, and he had this little spot that he used to just open in the summer, and it was mothballed, closed up. So I was looking for things to do, and we got talking, and he said, "You know what? We can hook up with this company, and they'll bring you the machines." And what they would do is they would come in and clean out all the coin, and they'd take 75% and leave me with 25. And then I'd do the books. If you're that scary enough.
Oh my God, you did the books.
A teenager. And so I'd do the math, subtract out whatever stuff I sold, and then Craig would let me keep the profit. So yeah, I did that for a while. I made a little money and had a
Wow.
little fun. So yeah, that was my early
Not
business
bad.
days.
Not
Wow.
bad. How
That's
could I ever doubt him,
crazy.
Ian? How could I
That's
ever
so
doubt him?
cool. That's really
great.
cool.
Well,
And for the
your next-
record, I was no good at pinball and no good at
No.
pool or any of that stuff. So
Well, your next hat is going to say Pinball Wizard. on it.
pinball was
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
impressed. I'm impressed. All right. That, my friends, is It's Not a Lie if
you
believe it.
Yeah.
And we'll have another story coming up on our next episode.
It's gonna be Robbie next time. Robbie next
I
time.
believe so. I believe so. I have to come up with a good business idea. I didn't
Yeah,
do
yeah. See what you
to
can do.
try to match that. All right. Shane is here. So we're going to drop in and chat with Shane here in the Vickers Crossing.
Let's bring him in.
And we are so happy that Shane Claiborne has joined us on the latest edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast. Shane, welcome. We're so glad that you could spend some time with us today. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm great. Pumped to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
All right.
glad
And
you
you
could be
are,
here.
where are you? Tell our listeners from whence you hail.
Well, I'm actually been living off of a little solar powered school bus that we, it's been converted into a little mobile tiny house. So we got a composting toilet and whatnot. And,
Yeah.
I'm not on it right now, but we're parked at my wife's parents in North Carolina. So
very good.
Katie and I just celebrated 10 years of marriage together.
wow.
So we've
Happy
been,
anniversary.
Good for you. Well, happy
Yeah.
anniversary. That's great
hanging
news.
out with our family and enjoying the beautiful South, the mountains here in Appalachia.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Well, yeah. I thought you were up in
Beautiful.
Philadelphia. So you're down in back in that neck of the woods, eh? Back in the South.
Yeah, that's right. I grew up in Tennessee
That's right.
and I've been in Philly for 25 years. So
Yeah.
we've taken this year to spend some time with our family, live on a bus. Katie said she's going to write a book called The Bus Life Now.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, we're digging it. I'm
That's
writing
great.
a book right now and doing a few things. It's a weird season, but we've used it as a great opportunity to hang out with our biological family down here. We've been
That's
wanting
awesome.
to do that for a while.
Good for you. Good for you. Hey, I wanted to ask you too about Tony Campolo and how he is doing. We had him booked a little while back before, of course, he became ill and wasn't able to do this. But have you had an opportunity to talk to him, wondering how he's doing?
Yeah, in fact, I've been hanging out with him every week for the month of May on Sundays. We've been doing, we wrote a book together, Red Letter Revolution.
right.
So we've been doing a hangout time on Sunday afternoons at 4. So we've had a great time. It's one of the first things Tony's done since his stroke. So
Awesome.
yeah, he's ready to get back at it though and be preaching the word. And, so it's fun to do that virtually. And yeah, so he's doing pretty good. I saw him 2
Good.
days ago.
Well,
Good.
pass
Good.
on our
Well, yeah,
best.
looking forward to getting him back into action and hearing from him again.
Yeah, we were, I think it was within a few weeks, actually, he was to be on when he had the stroke, and we were praying for him, and
Yeah.
glad to hear he's doing better. I wanted to jump in our conversation today, I guess, and sort of start with, something that's obviously very big on your agenda and is very prescient right now in terms of the American culture, which is gun violence. We're just 18 weeks into 2021, and already the United States has experienced 194 mass shootings. So that averages out to about 10 a week, which is incredibly hard to get our heads around. I mean, we just here, I must say, can't conceive of it. And how many deaths there are each day. There were 11 attacks that took place just this weekend, including back in Philly, where you hang out. You and your community have been doing incredible work in advocating for an end to gun violence and sensible gun control. Your book, Beating Guns, Hope for a People Wary of Violence. In it, you speak of the issue as a pro-life issue, really. I mean, you call for communities to stand against death in all of its ugly forms, you say, and becoming champions for life consistently. You write in the book, according to the prophets, though, peace does not begin with kings or presidents or heads of state. They're the ones who keep creating the wars. Peace begins with the people. It's not politicians who lead the way to peace. It's the people of God who lead the politicians to peace. Peace begins with the people of God who refuse to kill and who insist on beating their weapons into farm tools. The prophecy ends with the vision of a world free of violence, but it begins with us. Faith is all about not letting the current reality hijack the future. Faith refuses to accept the world as it is and insists on moving the world towards what it should be. Can I just get some reaction, I guess, from in terms of the current situation and the seeming rise in all of these mass shootings? But I just know from being at the Oblate School when you were down there and you spoke, I got to hold one of those garden implements that you guys and your community have been making by literally beating guns into farm tools. I wonder if you can share a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the right place to begin is with a deep sense of grief over the lives that are lost, and any person that doesn't begin there, I think,
Yeah.
we might want to do a heart check, because the fact is that the mass shootings get a lot of attention, and of course they deserve it. So many lives lost in these mass shootings, but what we sometimes miss is the everyday shootings. That over 100 lives lost every day to gun violence.
Incredible.
And even in the pandemic, we had record numbers of over 40,000 people that died from gun violence in the pandemic.
Wow.
So some of these, in Philadelphia, we hit 500 homicides, which is the highest that it's been in decades. And that's during the pandemic, right?
Incredible.
So, in my lifetime, we've lost more lives domestically to guns than in all of the wars in U.S. history combined, all the casualties of war. So yeah, I think it's impossible to say that we're pro-life and to ignore the epidemic of gun violence. And, what we do about it, I think that's where the conversation happens, right? But to begin with that grief, and proximity makes all the difference, because I grew up with guns. I grew up hunting, I grew up very comfortable with being around guns. And as I moved to Philadelphia, I saw another side of guns, and of gun violence. The almost every corner of our neighborhood, we have memorials to the lives that were lost to guns, and the collective memory of those incidents. And in fact, just this week, Katie was just showing me, we got a text that one of the young men across the street from where we live in Philadelphia was just killed, and they're having a GoFund thing to try to pay for his funeral. It's just so tragic, right? Yeah. So I think that's where we began, and that's why we subtitled our book for a book for folks who are weary of violence, tired of it, and that's what happens in the scripture that you offered that inspires so much of our work in converting the metal from guns into garden tools has been this vision of Micah and Isaiah, where apparently the people get fed up, they begin to take things into their own hands and literally to melt down their swords into plows, to transform metal that's designed to kill into tools that are designed for life. And so that I know not everybody can see those tools, but we've been making these shovels out of donated guns, and even the wood that we use for the handle is from the wood stock.
From the stock. Gun. Wow, cool.
Yeah. We've got, plows that we make, and I've started making crosses that are, I give to a lot of bishops and pastors, and then we make these necklaces that are out of a slice of a gun barrel that we crush into a heart. But as we do it, there's the beautiful symbolism. Yeah. But there's also it's more than that. It's more than symbolic. We traveled the whole country with the forge every night, converting a donated gun into a garden tool. But what we also do is we invite people who the language we use is if you've been directly impacted by gun violence, maybe you've known someone that's taken their life by suicide or that's taken someone else's life, and we invite them first, if they want to take the hammer. And what we've realized is I use the word sacrament, a church word, but it means there's a holy mystery, there's something mystical and transcendent that happens. And that's what we've seen at the Forge. I mean, we've seen folks that have literally taken someone else's life that as they beat on that gun, that's what they're
Wow.
remembering. And they told us
Mhm.
their story.
Wow.
We've seen other folks that have lost their closest loved ones to
Right.
guns. Folks like my friend Sharon Risher, who lost a lot of her family in the Emmanuel church shooting in
Oh, yeah.
South Carolina. And
Right.
as she's beating on that gun, she named her mother. She
Wow.
named the Emmanuel Nine, all the 9 foot, two of her cousins that were killed in
Mm.
that shooting. And she also said to me afterwards, she's crying, and she says,
Yeah.
there's something that is, this is healing,
There's a
in my heart.
catharsis.
Yeah.
And she
Yeah.
said, she also said, but kind of winsomely, she said, and everything I've kind of thought in my mind I might want to do to Dylan Roof, I just took it out on the metal of that
Mm.
gun.
Right.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
mean, literally, I think that it heals some of the wounds, to create space and honor the grief and trauma of those who have been impacted by gun violence.
Right.
It's
Right.
interesting because I think the image, if I remember it from the book too, is you sort of speak of the anvil as the table, as a place to lay out all of that. Like you invite people around the table, and in that context, whether they've been victims of violence or perpetrators of violence, or I like your turn of phrase, if you've been impacted at all by any of this, to come around that anvil, come around a forge, as a place where and I love the language of sacrament, where there's an outward and a visible sign of an inward and an invisible grace. Right? That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like the Spirit has been working in all of this, right? Well, I mean, we have
Mhm.
this whole kind of blacksmith theology now.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
I love it.
But I mean, it's so true, and I mean, the wild thing is you see some of this in Scripture. Iron sharpening iron. I
That's
mean, we're
right.
literally learning
yeah.
about that, and
Yeah.
even the images of God as a fire. We often say that, at the forge, we're remembering that. We need to stay near to the Spirit of God, that appears to Moses in the burning bush, right?
right.
This
Mhm.
fire of God that we have in Scripture, because the fire keeps our hearts soft.
Yes.
And
Right.
just as
Right.
the heat of the forge softens the metal, we often say it's kind of what we need in our own lives to be shaped by God. You have to keep coming back to the fire.
Right.
And the while, I mean, I'm not going to get on my sermon, here, but literally you see this kind of cold, hard, dark metal that as it comes into the forge, it begins to actually take on the character of the fire, right?
Right.
So there's
Wow.
points where
Yeah.
you can no
Yeah.
longer tell the metal from the fire. It's all just glowing orange. And as you
Right.
take it out, you have to keep returning it to the fire. So yeah, there's a whole sermon in there. But
Oh, yeah.
we sometimes say that maybe, what happened to Pharaoh is
Yes.
that he just stayed away from the fire too long,
That's right,
because
yeah.
it says that his heart was hardened.
That's right.
So and I think there's also this element that there's people who say that gun violence is not a gun issue, it's a heart issue.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm convinced of is that it can be both a heart
Right.
issue and a gun issue. And we need God to heal hearts.
Yes.
But God, we might be waiting on God to change laws, and God might be waiting on us, because
Yeah.
we've
Yeah.
been given,
Yeah.
the capacity to change some of our gun laws so that we do a better job of protecting life.
Sure. Well, certainly not unconnected to that conversation is, and speaking of laws, is a conversation around the death penalty in the United States. And we were just talking about and reading about what's happening in South Carolina, and lawmakers have passed a bill to allow inmates on death row to be executed by firing squad in the absence of lethal injection drugs, which is just, certainly up here north of the border. That's something. Oh my gosh!
We're just gonna line you up and shoot
it's
you.
like, what? Yeah, sounds like something out of a movie. But when signed into law, it'll make the South Carolina the fourth state in the country to offer the option. The legislation passed by the South Carolina House of Representatives aims to restart executions by bypassing the difficulties that states face in procuring the drugs for lethal injection. And it goes to the Republican governor who has vowed to sign it. And he's written on Twitter, "We are one step closer to providing victims, families, and loved ones with the justice and closure they are owed by law." But of course, the question is, will it do that, or will it bring closure? And I want to reference something from your great book, Executing Grace. And you argue that the death penalty does actually not bring closure at all. You argue for restorative justice. And there's a wonderful quote here by, is it Abba? Yeah, Abba Gale, whose 19-year-old daughter was murdered. And she said, I knew that I didn't need the state of California to murder another human being so that I could be healed. It's time to stop teaching people hate and start teaching people love. The whole execution as closure idea is not realistic. Anger is just a horrible thing to do to your body, not to mention what it does to your soul and to your spirit. Forgiveness is not saying what he did was right. It's taking back your power. Shane, can you say a bit more about this and really how we've been seduced by this violence?
Yeah, well, first of all, it might feel like we're jumping from one issue to the other, but I want to say that
It's the same.
these are very connected, and
Right.
our and you know, I'm actually writing a book right now on a better ethic of life, right? What it really means to be for life, and I grew up with the language of pro-life. But I only thought of that in terms of abortion, right? And so we've so narrowly defined what it means to be pro-life that I think we'd actually be more accurate, many of us, to say that we're pro-birth, you know, or we're anti-abortion.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the irony is that in America, you can say that you're pro-life and still be pro-guns, pro-death penalty, pro-military, anti-environment, you know, on the wrong side of life on almost every other issue than abortion. And so I want to be for life consistently. And that's, to me, to be for life means caring about ending the death penalty, caring about gun violence, caring about issues other than abortion. And yet I also care about abortion. We had a town hall meeting in January talking about exactly that. How do we reduce and eradicate abortion, the need for abortion? When I look at the early church, one of the things that strikes me is how consistent their ethic of life was. I've got a great book by my friend, Ron Sider, which is the early Christians, all their own words. It's just edited, really. And it's called The Early Church on Killing. And it shows how consistently they spoke out against violence in every manifestation it had. I mean, the early Christians spoke passionately about militarism and war. They spoke passionately about the death penalty. Of course, it didn't, you know, hurt that they were the victims of state execution, you know, but they were also like speaking out against the gladiatorial games, you know, this kind of celebration of violence in their particular culture. You know, they were just beautiful force for love and for life. And what I found in the US that was really haunting for me is that on especially these two issues, guns and capital punishment, Christians were not the champions of life on these two issues in particular. Christians are the highest gun owning demographic in America.
Wow.
We own guns at a higher rate than the general population, and white evangelical Christians in particular. When it comes to the death penalty, the states that are known as the Bible Belt, right? That is the death belt in America. So states like Tennessee, where the governor nearly every week tweets out a Bible verse, just brought back the electric chair. In fact, we used the electric chair recently in the last 2 years. And so you see states like South Carolina that are bringing back the firing squad. It's no coincidence that these same states, not only are they the Bible Belt, but they are formerly the Confederacy, right? So these are the states that held on to slavery the longest and used the Bible to defend it, right? So this theology is entrenched in this culture. Like literally, South Carolina just had a day off, a state vacation day for the Confederate Memorial Day, right? And this is also where Dylan Roof, as I mentioned before, you know, holding the Confederate flag in so many of his pictures, then went as kind of an armed, young, radicalized white terrorist and shot African Americans in the middle of their Wednesday prayer meeting. So that, you know, this is all connected. And yet here's the beautiful thing is not only is Sharon Risher, my friend whose mother was killed in the Emmanuel Church shooting, not only has she been on panels and conferences speaking against gun violence, but she's also been speaking against the death penalty. Because she says Dylan Roof doesn't need to be killed. He needs to know the transformative love and power of God's grace to change even a hardened heart like that, right? So she and others have become opponents to the death penalty, even though their closest family members were killed. And I think what you realize from so many family members of folks that have been killed is that they realize, like, killing is the problem, not the solution.
Not the solution,
right?
yeah.
And I mean, Jesus even kind of challenges the ancient version of justice, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that did allow for reciprocal harm, right?
Yes.
And Jesus says, you've heard it said, an eye
Yes.
for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I show you this. And what I think he's showing us is that you don't heal the wounds of violence with more violence.
Right.
We don't rape people who rape to
Right.
show that rape is wrong. And we certainly shouldn't live into this myth that we're going to show that killing is wrong by killing someone else. So I'm so grateful for the voices, especially of those who have been victims of violence and lost their loved ones to violent crime, that they really name that fact, that the death penalty is not real justice. It's actually state vengeance. You know, it just mirrors the evil rather than healing the wounds of evil.
Well, it's an incredible book, Executing Grace, and that actually is one of the most profound things I took from it, was the number of people who have lost loved ones because of the violence, because of gun violence, who will speak up and say they're opposed to, and some of whom you've written about who have advocated for those on death row, who've actually stood up and said, no, you got to stop this. This is not the answer. This is not going to give me the closure that Governor McMaster is talking about from a firing squad. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many things that, you know, I unpack. It's why I devoted a whole book to it. You know, the racial dynamics, all kinds of dynamics that we have to, layers of the death penalty, the theology behind it. But I just want to say, you know, for starters, that one of the most fundamental questions raised by the death penalty is, do we believe that anyone is beyond redemption?
That's right.
So even someone like Dylan Roof, who is has done something horribly evil and at this point is unapologetic about it, right? I think he's in imminent danger, and we need to be protected from his hatred and racism.
Amen.
And yet we hold out the hope that even someone who's murdered a person can be made new, as scripture says, right? I mean, if we believe that murderers are beyond redemption, we could rip out half the Bible.
That's right. Those people
Moses murdered someone. David, you know, raped Bathsheba and had her husband Uriah killed. Saul of Tarsus was a terrorist. I mean, and yet the whole story is about the redemption and God's grace. You know, as my friend Brian Stevenson says, we're all more than the worst thing that we've ever done.
And thanks be to God for that.
That's what this whole story is about.
Yeah, we need to hear that.
Yeah. Well, continuing on from that, like you say, none of these things are unconnected. When you talk about being pro-life, being about pro so many things, the other thing, of course, is immigration. I want to just touch on this a little bit, just because of, you know, particularly what's been happening at the southern border in the United States, and things really got ugly during the previous administration down there. And I know even in terms of the conversation around refugees, you've been pretty outspoken. It looked as though for a time there that Biden was going to go back on his promise to increase the number of refugees, but your voice, I think, and others have helped push that forward. The images out of the southern border were hard to imagine. I know when I met you a few years ago in San Antonio, once you finished the conference at the Oblate School, you were headed to the border. That was your next stop. You've been a long time advocate for communities of faith that welcome the stranger. You told the story to us in that conference about a community of Christians on the border who'd begun a sort of a cross-border worship where communion was shared and so on. And I know you've other experiences of how you've seen the love of Jesus made manifest both on the border and in cities like Philadelphia with the new sanctuary movement. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how Christians can model Matthew 25:35. You know, I was a stranger and you welcomed me, because there are some communities out there, and you've been involved with them, that against this sort of narrowness and violent sort of reaction, this erecting of walls. You've been a part of communities and know of communities that are trying to extend tables, flourishing tables, and I wonder if you can share some of that with our listeners.
Well, Matthew 25 that you mentioned is a really great place to start, right? Where Jesus says, when you welcome the stranger, you welcome me. When you don't welcome the stranger, you don't welcome me. I mean, it doesn't get much, more.
Pretty clear.
Yeah.
I mean, like, tell me how you really feel. Right?
Stop being ambiguous, Jesus.
I mean, and we can certainly, say that when you put kids in cages, we do it to Jesus, right?
That's right.
Whatever we are doing to, and this is not just Jesus. I mean, Jesus, I'm a red letter Christian. I love
Yes.
the red letters that in the gospel, but this is a theme all through Scripture, right?
That's right.
The Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, tell us that we're to welcome the foreigner
That's right.
as if they were our own flesh and blood, because
Yeah.
we ourselves were once foreigners in
foreigners,
Egypt. Like, look at how God welcomed us, right? And we look all the way, into the New Testament. You see James saying that true religion is caring for the widow and the orphan in their distress, right?
That's
We
right.
see the New Testament saying that we should welcome the stranger because we might be entertaining angels
yeah.
unawares. So we
Beautiful.
might be bringing in angels. We might be bringing in Jesus. Like this is not just a political issue.
Right.
It's a spiritual opportunity, right? That immigrants are not just a debate.
No.
But immigrants are neighbors to be loved. They're made in the image of God. And I think this is also one of the things that's so radical about the Jesus's idea that we are to be born again, right? Is that we are literally to have a spiritual rebirth that redefines who us and them are, right? That now we are to love bigger than biology.
Yes.
And that's why when Jesus's own biological family come to him, he questions, they say, your mother and brothers are here. And he says, who are my mother and my brothers? Like we've got a different definition of family, right? And Mother Teresa understood this. Is why many people called her mother, was because she had raised all these kids she found, in train stations, abandoned on the streets. And so I met some of those kids, and they said, she raised us, she was our mother. And that's where she got the name Mother Teresa. But one of the things that she used to say is that sometimes our biggest problem is that the circle we've put around our family is too small, is too small. Yeah. And that I think is why Jesus challenges biological family, because it can become an obstacle to showing love beyond your own people, right?
Yes.
And nationality is so dangerous because it's so narrow. A love for our own people is a good thing, but our love doesn't stop at borders, and no wall can hold it back. We're to love as big as God loves, right? So that's this call to show hospitality to the immigrants and to foreigners, to strangers, to the homeless, to folks who are struggling, is at the very heart of our faith. And I'm encouraged by the courageous kind of prophetic witness of folks like you mentioned on the border that have been having these services where they pass each other communion over the wall, and they kind of proclaim that idea that we if someone's suffering on the other side of this wall, it's as tragic as if it were my own mother or my own sister or brother or child. So, and this is not a partisan thing. I want to just be really transparent. I don't have any loyalty to political party.
Right. Yeah.
I am trying as hard as I can to be loyal to Jesus, and that's. I was
going to say you're pretty loyal to following in the way of Jesus. I know that.
But this is why I'm concerned, is that why it's not partisan, is that some of our highest numbers of refugees and immigrants have come under Republican presidents.
Yes.
And yet our lowest numbers came under Donald Trump's presidency, our lowest numbers in recent history. And yet, now this is the kicker, right? Is that Joe Biden has been set to welcome fewer immigrants and refugees than any president in modern history, including Donald Trump. So his numbers were lower. And thankfully, he is listening, I think, and responding to, so many different people that are are trying to find a better path forward. But we still have detention centers that look just like Trump never left office, right? We
That's
still
right.
have folks that have already been vetted
Yes.
by a intense vetting process to be welcomed in as asylum seekers and refugees. And
Yeah.
yet those numbers are still a lot lower than I would like to see them. So,
Right.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit then again about being political. I mean, you mentioned, don't want to make this partisan, and it's about following the way of Jesus. But this might be a shock to you, Shane, but some people have criticized you for being political. I mean, I know, I'm glad you're sitting down when you hear that. But you're right. You're right in your book, in the book Red Letter Revolution, that you engage though in politics, that you engage with local politics because it affects the people that you love. You engage in national politics because it affects the people that you love. And you're right, governments can do lots of things, but there are a lot of things they can't do. A government can pass good laws, but no law can change your human heart. Only God can do that. A government can provide good housing, but folks can have a house without having a home. We can keep people breathing with good health care, but they still may not really be alive. The work of community, love, reconciliation, restoration is the work that we cannot leave up to politicians. This is the work we're called to do. We can't wait on politicians to change the world, and we can't wait on governments to legislate love, and we don't let politicians define how we treat people. How we treat people shapes our policies. That's fantastic. Yeah. And I mean, you asked the important question, right? What would it look like if Jesus were in charge of my neighborhood and my block? And you're right a bit in your book, Jesus for President, about that. You're there. It is there. Yeah, you're advocating for a community response, right? Can you talk a little bit to us about why politics matter and how those of us that follow in the way of Jesus can engage to that in such a way that, like you say, Jesus is in charge of the neighborhoods in our cities and our countries?
Yeah, well, Martin Luther King has been a real helpful example on this. Dr. King, one of his great lines is he said, "No law can make you love me, but it can make it harder for you to kill me."
That's right. That's right.
No law can make you love me, but we
right.
can make it harder for you to kill me. And he really saw this as not separate either. God is healing hearts, and personal salvation is a part of this. But there's also this social transformation, and this thing that Jesus talked about almost every time he opened his mouth, which was the kingdom of God, which might sound a little like archaic to us, but it was language that was ripped right out of the culture, and the imperial lexicon of his time was like, this is the reign of God, the empire of God. It was the same word, right? So, and we might think of it as the dream of God. What does it look like for that to come on earth? What does it look like for it to come in, London, Ontario, or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania? What does it look like for God's dream to come on my block, in my neighborhood, in my city? And God's dream doesn't look like 100 lives lost every day to guns. God's dream doesn't look like the absolute desecration of the earth. It doesn't look like I don't think there's a place for nuclear bombs in the reign of God. So we sort of go like, how do we live into that dream? And that's, again, I think where Dr. King had this profound sense that he used to say that the church is not meant to be the servant or the master of the state. The church is meant to be the conscience of the state, the prophetic conscience of our nation.
Right.
And so there's a really important distinction that you made between being political versus being partisan.
Right.
And I believe that, the word politics, even as distasteful as it sometimes is to us, the real root of the word is polis, is people. It's about living together in a society where people thrive, right? And we should all want that. And we can form policies that allow life to flourish, or that absolutely crush and destroy people's dignity in life. And so, in our country right now, I think we're faced with a real critical question, which is we're faced with a choice between love and fear. I
Right.
really believe
Mhm.
that, and there's that beautiful scripture that says, perfect love casteth out fear.
Oh, fair, yeah.
And yet I think many of our policies are being formed more by fear
Yes.
than by
Yeah,
love.
yeah. Oh,
And
yeah, you hear that.
the
Yep.
question we get to ask,
Mhm.
is what would it look like if if love was the compelling force behind our policies rather than fear on immigration? No one's just going to say we don't need a border. Like, I think people are saying, how do we welcome people well?
Right,
How do
right,
we have
right.
love rather than fear
Mhm.
driving us? How do we create a path for citizenship for people that need it? And so I think our obsession with guns, so many of our policies and our rhetoric, especially over the past few years, has really been much more driven by fear. And we do terrible, dangerous things when fear is really compelling us rather than love. So yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned Mother Teresa briefly in an answer that you had a little bit ago, and I wanted to sort of circle back to that. Mother Teresa said, Calcutta is everywhere if only we have eyes to see. Find your Calcutta. And you met and worked with Mother Teresa. Can you share the story of how you ended up in Calcutta and how Mother Teresa impacted your faith journey?
Yeah, well, I had heard the story, first of all, that, Mother Teresa had a lot of people that came to India to work with her. And she would often say, come and see, like, come and see our experiment in living out the love of God,
Yeah.
and yet I also heard stories that there were people that were convinced that they had to go to India, that she said, find your own Calcutta. You don't
right.
have to, go to Calcutta to find Calcutta. Like, pray that God would give you eyes to see the people who are hurting around you. So, I reached out in that spirit, and we already had a lot of stuff sort of starting to percolate in Philadelphia. And I was still in college, so my friends and I called her from. We actually called her from a payphone.
They called
Which,
Mother
No
Teresa.
way.
But
That's right.
the young people might need to know that payphones were things that we used to put coins
That's
into,
right.
and you
That's
would
what
call.
quarters were used for. Yeah.
And
so you called India on a payphone.
yeah, and I had actually the funny part is I had made several calls beforehand because I wanted to try to find the best number, and most of the nuns I called just thought I was a prank caller or something. But this one nun gave me a number, and she said, I think this will work. Give it a call, give it a shot. So, I'm calling from the payphone, and I did my math. So I'm calling at like 2 a.m. So it would be, in the middle of the day in India, and my friends are all around me, like we're people of prayer. So they're praying, I'm
Yeah.
in my dorm room lounge on this payphone, and, it rings, and I'm expecting like a polite receptionist or something, missionaries of charity, how can we help you? And Mother Teresa just answers the phone, and she goes, hello. And I thought I had the wrong number. I just hear, hello. And I'm like, listen, I'm calling from the United States. Actually, I'm trying to get a hold of the missionaries of charity because we want to come work with Mother Teresa. And she goes, this is her.
That's crazy.
What?
So, then, to you cut it short, I just asked her if we could come work with her for the summer, and she said yeah. And and then I'm thinking very logically about where we will sleep, and I asked her, where will we sleep, and things like that, and she said, God takes care of the lilies and the sparrows. God will take care of you. Don't
That's
worry.
fantastic.
Just come on out here.
Yeah, just show up.
I'm like, cool. I hope that works when I tell my mom that. We're just we're living like the lilies and the sparrows, Mom. Yeah.
Yeah, don't worry.
Sure you are. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it was an amazing, transformative
Yeah.
experience. We worked pretty much all summer between my college years, and worked in the home for the dying. I worked in the orphanages. I did a lot of things there. I learned a depth of prayer that I had never really experienced, and so much from that. And I got to go back after she died. So it's continued to shape a lot of our work in Philly. In fact, above our door, we've got a quote that Mother Teresa used to say, what's important is not how much we do, but how much love we put into doing it. We're not
Right.
called to do great things. We're called to do small things with great love.
With
So
great love,
Amen.
we've
yeah,
got,
yeah.
above our door, it says small
Yeah.
things with great love. Let's do that today.
Yeah, it's a great mustard seed ministry, right? We're doing those small things with love, and they will grow for sure. Hey, Shane, I was so glad, we're talking about the fact that you're coming on today, and it just so happens that this morning we had we had a clergy meeting, a group of clergy from our city in our Anglican church, or the Episcopal Church in the U.S. for you guys. And we got into a conversation about poverty and death on the streets and the housing crisis, which is really difficult for us to be in the cities reeling from it right now. And there was a sense of frustration from our clergy leaders and all of us together in terms of our lack of answers within this ongoing crisis, because we do want to be there and part of the solution and being able to offer ourselves and our faith communities. And I wonder, though, as we were having this conversation, church leaders, clergy leaders talking about people on the street, if that was really the right group to be finding solutions, right? As we're having this conversation, there seems to be some voices missing from the table. And in your book, one of your books, you write about how we can admire and worship Jesus without doing what he did. We can applaud what he preached and stood for without caring about the same things. We can adore his cross without taking up ours. I had come to see that the great tragedy of the church is not that rich Christians do not care about the poor, but that rich Christians do not know the poor. And that was kind of the disconnect, as again, we're sitting around and talking about this, but we don't really know them. We're in our buildings and our churches and stuff. Can you say more about that? This disconnect between admiring Jesus and being among the poor and Christian communities talking about the poor all the time, as we were doing today?
Yeah, well, it became very clear to me that a lot of times our biggest problem in the church is not just a compassion problem, but a relationship problem, right? This proximity. And what we see in Jesus is a God that becomes proximate, right?
Yes.
A God that actually doesn't just come as a missionary to the poor, but is born with brown skin as a refugee in a manger because there's no room in the inn, is executed, on the cross, like in every way is leaving all the comfort of heaven. Jesus does this and joins the struggle here on earth. And yet I think many times we don't always follow Jesus to the trenches and to the margins, right? Derek Webb, a friend of mine, he wrote a song. There's a powerful line that something like this. It goes, "God's been good. I've finally been able to move out of Jesus's neighborhood."
That's great.
It's about
great line.
how the church has moved out of the very places that Jesus moved into,
Exactly
and
right.
so there's a danger in that. I think that everything in this world is pulling us away from the suffering, away from the neighborhoods where there's high crime or there's people that don't look like us or whatever it is. And yet the gravity of the gospel takes us right into those places. Right. And it is a relationship thing. I look at Matthew 25, and again, when Jesus is, this is the final judgment. It seems like something we should pay attention to, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And Jesus says, that we'll be separated and we'll be asked, like, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was homeless, did you welcome me? When I was sick, did you take care of me? When I was in prison, did you come visit me?
Yeah.
And they're all about these personal acts of mercy and compassion. And so, I think that's the real, it's not that our works earn our salvation. I always like to be careful about that, but
Yes.
our works demonstrate our salvation. If we aren't visiting people in prison, we might not be Christians,
Right.
if we are not welcoming the stranger and caring for the sick. So these are all real manifestations of our faith. And, as my friend Tony Campolo says that, he says, God's not saying to the folks who are in prison, come find the church.
No.
Right.
Saying,
Yeah.
to us, go into the world.
That's
And Tony also says, in the end, according to Matthew 25, this whole thing is not going to be a doctrinal test where God's going to ask us, virgin birth.
Yeah.
agree or disagree. Like
Yeah.
God's going to ask us, when I was a stranger, did you welcome me in? So I think it is about that relationship. And, I also come out of the roots of the Catholic worker movement, and Dorothy Day had this idea of personalism, that we're personally responsible for our neighbor's well-being. To love our neighbor as ourselves means that we sleep uneasily. If we have a heated house and a bed when someone else is on the street in a cardboard box. And so like she said, if simply every Christian would welcome a homeless person, we would end homelessness overnight.
Yeah, it would be done, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's quite right. In fact, and I mean, I think that's the thing. And that book, The Irresistible Revolution, is a great sort of, it's a provocative book in that it sort of pushes us to consider, those difficult questions, because you're right. It's not because of our works, but following in the way of Jesus, it is a way of doing things, a way of living, a way of being, a way of relating. It's relationship. It's coming into proximity with God. And so it's powerful stuff. Listen, we've taken up lots of your time. I'll leave.
Let me just tell you one quick little memory of when I was, because many of your listeners might be Anglican. I was with the Archbishop Justin Welby of the Anglican church, and we were wrestling with this. He's got this enormous compound. I stayed there, Lambert Palace. I stayed there.
Wow.
Did you should have driven your bus in there, is what you should have done.
That's right.
Hard to get it across the pond.
I know.
But we were wrestling with this because he's like, we've got all this real estate, of these resources. What does it look like to welcome those that are in need? And he's asking that as the Archbishop, in Lambert Palace.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of people that we want there, right? And I think that's something that we have to reckon with those contradictions and realize that we can worship Jesus without always doing the stuff he said. And Jesus didn't come to make believers, but to form disciples and to make followers. So
well, it's one of the difficult questions we grappled with this morning, actually, in that meeting, because I said, like, we've got a group here that just had an interim solution to homelessness through the winter that's shifting to more permanent housing, and what they need right now is real estate. They need a place. And so I said, we're talking about this. Are any of us willing to give up our churches? Like, is there anybody here willing to put their hand up? Are we willing to say, I got a building, maybe this is the place, I don't know. And that's the sort of mischievous questions, right? And you talk about holy mischief, Shane, and it's very similar to me, to John Lewis's idea to get into good trouble, to get out there and find good trouble. One of the greatest moments sitting listening to you in San Antonio a couple of years ago was you saying about how, you were a pretty good boy growing up, and your mom would have been until you found Jesus. So I just wonder if you can tell our listeners what you said that day, if you remember. But I'm sure you do, because I'm sure you tell this story. But you never got in trouble, but then you found Jesus. And tell us what sort of a story or two about holy mischief and what you're up to. What mischief are you into nowadays?
Yeah, well, I have always been, found the paradox in the fact that there are a lot of people that come up and tell me, my life was such a mess, and then I met Jesus, and they'll tell me I went to jail, I did all this stuff, and then I met Jesus, and then my life came together, and I'm like, God bless you. For me, I was a pretty good kid, and I met Jesus, and he messed me up. I didn't go to jail before Jesus. I went to jail many times since I met Jesus, because of Jesus.
That's right.
And so, I think that there's so many sides of Jesus, right? I mean, weeping over Jerusalem because they didn't know the things that would lead for peace. And then we see Jesus flipping the temples, the table in the temple. And I think of that, this holy disruption, Jesus, there's a reason that people plotted to kill Jesus.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And he was, doing this kind of the holy mischief and the good trouble. It's also, why I think so many of the prophets went to jail. They were killed. You think of Dr. King, Dr. King, before he was killed, he said that when he first went to jail, he was troubled, but then he looked at history and saw what good company he had, behind bars. and people accused of him being maladjusted, and he embraced the word. He said,
That's right. Yeah.
we live in a world that's become way too adjusted to injustice, way too adjusted to the inequity between the rich and the poor, way too adjusted to racism and violence. So I think that call is in Romans, that we're not to conform to the patterns of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, right? And so, what that looks like for us is we've felt the need to challenge unjust policies and laws, in our own city. I mean, the first time I went to jail was when we were challenging the anti-homeless laws that prohibited sharing food in public places. Literally, our city made it illegal to bring a bunch of pizzas into the park and share them with folks on the street. And we challenged those laws. We went to jail over and over challenging those laws, and we won. We many times in court. In fact, we went all the way to a federal court. There's a lot of people that talk about religious freedom in our country, but we had a different take on it. We said to say that we cannot feed the homeless is to say that we cannot feed Christ. It's a violation of our religious freedom. The same argument has been made by my friends on the border who have been putting water in the desert.
That's right.
And they're saying that actually to say we cannot put water in the desert is a violation of our faith. And so I think that we need to have that kind of courage, and to realize that a lot of the great saints of old that we walk in their footsteps, they were holy troublemakers, And it's why, John Lewis rested in peace, as he said, we can smile in our mug shots when we get arrested because we know that we are on the right side of history. So this prophetic vision is that we're going to live into the world that God wants. We're going to refuse to accept the world as it is and insist on living into the dream of God. And that's going to ruffle some feathers. I mean, you don't change things like slavery or apartheid or the death penalty without challenging the status quo. And before every social movement that has changed the world, everybody said it's impossible.
That's right.
The abolition of slavery, impossible to imagine. And after that social movement, everybody looks back and says it's inevitable.
That's right. That's right.
That's why I think that the call of Jesus is a call to have courage, because we're imagining the world as it could be. And when you do that, I think it challenges the status quo. But that's I think that's one of our core vocations as Christians is to try to reimagine the world, that we're literally trying to see the reign of God come on earth as it is in heaven.
Well, you certainly help us do that, my friend. And boy, we are so grateful for your time today, for your witness, for your work. I know our listeners today will want a little more Shane Claiborne when this podcast is over. So look for the books. We're going to have some links on our website to Shane's books. And hey, brother, keep it going and enjoy that bus ride. And thanks for giving us your time today. Okay, be safe.
You all too. Yeah, thank you all for listening in too. Bless you.
And again, we thank Shane for joining us. And under the title books on our website, you can check there for books from many of our guests, and we're going to have some up for Shane as well. So if you want to read more about what he's got to say, we encourage you to do that. Great podcast today, guys. It's been good to get together. And again, we want to thank our sponsors on the Vickers Crossing, A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, and locally loved. And Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And until next time, gentlemen, I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George here from St. Aidan's Church.
And my name is Ian.
And Kevin, remember to always look both ways, my friend,
before you cross that street.
Wow. Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!